Lyndall Hatton, NASPO CEO, is the moderator for this session. Lyndall?
Thank you for joining us today. We recently released NASPO's academic research project studying the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the State Procurement Office. This project included in-depth interviews with over 48 state chief procurement officers, exploring their role in response to the pandemic through the lens of PPE procurement. The study identified specific themes of successful emergency operations, while highlighting the need for state procurement to be involved in early in emergency planning. This session, we will explore the long-term impact of the pandemic on state procurement and their interactions with the supplier community. Please join me in welcoming our four distinguished speakers. Roz Ingram, current president of NASPO Board and Director of State Purchasing and Chief Procurement Officer in the Division of State Procurement with the state of Florida. George Shutter, immediate past president of the NASPO Board and Chief Procurement Officer for the District of Columbia. Dr. Zhaohui Wu, Professor of Supply Chain and Operation Management from Oregon State University. Dr. Robert Hanfield from North Carolina State University, Bank of America University, Distinguished Professor of Supply Chain Management and Director of the Supply Chain Resource Cooperative. Before we get started, we have a couple of polling questions for you. For the suppliers in the audience, did you shift operations during the pandemic? It is a yes or no block. Please check one of those, if you would, to let us know. And we will watch here to see how many come in. Yes or no, if you shifted operations during the pandemic. I'm seeing several respond. Most are responding, yes, they did. A few no, but the majority definitely did so. Okay. Thank you very much. I see that we had basically, it appears over 90% did shift during the pandemic. Okay. Our second question that we want to pose to you, for suppliers with international operations, have you moved any production back to the United States from overseas? Once again, yes or no. If you would check one of those, we will allow you to respond. Waiting for a few of those to come in. It appears that a few are saying no, they have not. It's pretty close, about even, in terms of some have not. So we thank you. Allowing a few more to come in. It's a little bit split, but more no than yes presently. Approximately, if I'm looking at it correctly, over 60% said no, and 37% have said yes, they have. Okay, we thank you very much for those that responded to our first two poll questions. Now let's get started with Roz and George, who are here to speak to the CPO experience in responding to the pandemic. Roz, please describe what your office went through during this past year.
Well, thank you, Lyndall. So for Florida, we've always been proud, at least in the last 25 years, of our ability to respond quickly to emergencies. We have done it many times over. Andrew started it in '92, and we've just moved into a very well-established, robust response. And with a couple of minor exceptions, that didn't mean anything in March of last year. The only thing that I think gave us a leg up was our established protocol for emergencies, generally speaking. So we were able to respond quickly in our spots, if you will. Everybody had a place to be. And then when we got there, we ran into, of course, the hurdle everybody else, on at least from the state side, ran into, which is, what do we do now? We can't get anything. We can't do anything. We can't even get mutual aid, which we usually do. Different states make agreements because every state was dealing with the same thing. And not only were the states dealing, but the whole world. So for us, it sort of was a very frustrating feeling, and I'm sure that's shared by many, where we had nowhere to go with our need because the need far exceeded the supply. So that was very frustrating up front. Then that was compounded almost immediately within the first month of overwhelming interest from qualified vendors and sketchy vendors, if you will, the ones that just were trying to make a buck during a quick time. And so that was very frustrating as well. So we were trying to figure out a way to get through the large quantities of inquiries, and I'm talking in the thousands. There were quite a few. So DEM, our Division of Emergency Management, was able to build a logistics team also inside. I'm ESF 7, which is logistics, but they built an additional team working with the National Guard. So I sent people over. I think we got up to about 9 people that we sent over to work with the DEM to try to mitigate some of the issues on supply that we could. And the established vendor pool didn't matter because they didn't have it either. We had state-term contracts, didn't matter. Compounded on this, I would tell you that probably our most difficult thing to overcome was the emotional piece that was attached to this pandemic. And Florida has the largest elderly population in the country. So we had a very, very significant fear to deal with. And I think the fear piece was the part we had the hardest problem with, because we could not get things that we needed up front to be able to protect our citizens. So I would tell you in a nutshell, that's sort of how the problems initiated last year.
Thank you, Roz. George, looking over the past year, how would you describe or summarize the experience of your office during this pandemic?
I think, as Roz mentions, in the district, we have a pretty robust emergency operations center operations, and between snowstorms and weather events and events that we have on the mall for 4th of July or inaugurations, it's a robust emergency operations center. And like many emergencies, we had limited time for planning. We're able to work with the police and the fire chief in February to understand PPE needs. And we've always had contracting and limited logistics through our surplus property program embedded within the Emergency Operations Center. I think the big difference this last year is that when the emergency started coming, it was fast, it was furious, and it's lasted for a year. That first weekend in March, on a Saturday night, getting the call that needing a quarantine site, needing a full hotel contracted for by that next morning. And that tempo has continued for the past year. We've been able to utilize, as Roz mentioned in Florida, those protocols that are established in the Emergency Operations Center, the embedded contracting and procurement function that's within there to be able to continue to support. We've been able to also expand that initially managed through the surplus property program to a district strategic logistics center that now supports those supply chain needs, the logistics and distribution needs of the heavy throughput of commodities that have been born out of this emergency.
Thank you, George. Dr. Wu, after interviewing 48 state CPOs, tell me about the experience that you think that they shared with you in terms of procuring a PPE during this disaster. Were there any surprises?
Well, there are a few surprises. So one big surprise is that we studied disaster relief, disaster operations as faculties, and this is a science started in the 60s. And so the study says that natural disaster bring out the best of people. We kind of know it from the book, but really the experience of interviewing the state procurement buyers, the CPOs, and their counterparts in many cases really make this validate the point that I really see it and feel it, and also experienced what it means being by the best of bring the best of people during a time of crisis. And I think there's a sense of pride among the buyers and the purchasing officers in this long, enduring, grueling year where they work 24/7 in shifts to overcome the difficulty to save lives. And when we started the research with the idea of looking to the organizational structure, and it matters a lot as you saw from the study. But in the meantime, we also see that the self-initiatives of the states and their approach are so different, and eventually it's the people that make a difference. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Wood. Dr. Hanfield, what is your overall impression from these interviews regarding state procurement response to this disaster?
Well, this was a fascinating study for me because, as Dr. Wu said, we were able to interview pretty much CPOs from every state. And I want to thank everyone who's on the call today who did participate for taking the time to do that, as well as for the great staff at NASPO, especially Rebecca, for organizing and getting on everyone's calendar. That was a Herculean task in and of itself. But the things that I took away is like Wu said, COVID was a really unique disaster. Typically disasters involve hurricanes or floods or fires. They last at most 1 or 2 weeks. This thing just went on and on and on, and it wasn't about just mobilizing supplies. It was about resources, facility space, office equipment, moving people back to work, operating remotely, getting access to hospitals, to food, shelter, water, and then following all the FEMA guidelines around this on top of it. And procurement all of a sudden was faced with tasks in many cases that they had never done before, that they had to figure out. For instance, a lot of people said, we do contracting. We don't do a lot of procurement. We don't know logistics. We don't operate warehouses. We don't source globally from suppliers in Asia and have to deal with manifests and tariffs and payment terms. And again, the payment terms in many cases, at least for PPE, was 50% upfront, or in some cases 100% upfront, which was also completely unprecedented. So nothing about this event had caught, I think everything about it caught everybody by surprise, and procurement people had to learn a lot of skills along the way. The good news, the silver lining here, is people also figured out pretty quickly how resourceful procurement people can be in an emergency. And the fact that they were able to respond and figure it out, get warehouse space, be able to secure supplies, be able to vet these suppliers who in many cases there were forgeries out there, counterfeit, there were scams, all kinds of scams, and being able to deal with all of this and emerge, in reasonably good shape, pretty darn good shape in most cases, I think is a testimony to the great work and the skills of the people out there on the front lines.
Thank you. That very noteworthy. Remaining with our academic partners here, Dr. Hanfield, coming back to you, what relationships, supplier, state procurement offices, what worked? What strategies and partnerships did you see, observe, were successful?
So we saw states reaching out to a lot of private sector individuals, and that came in all shapes and sizes, right? And so some of those were, there would be a friend of the governor. I know a guy, right, who can help you. And so a lot of those where you had to take every call. You had to respond, because if it was someone who knew the governor or what have you, you absolutely had to respond. In many cases, some of those calls were, they just didn't have a lot there. They were trying to become a distributor or what have you. In other cases, they were able to leverage the private sector And there's some great examples here. In New York, one of the hardest hit states up front, they were able to deal with some people who were in global trade, who were in the embassies, and were able to make contacts with people in China to be able to get access to PPE. In Michigan, there were people who were able to work with General Motors. In this case, General Motors has factories in Asia. They had people on the ground who were supplier quality professionals who could go to these suppliers and vet them and make sure that they were the real deal, and were able to help them secure logistics, help them get product through the airport and what have you. Logistics alone was a tremendous challenge in this issue. The airport, for instance, coming out of Shanghai, you couldn't get any air freight. It was $1 million to get a single plane to come from Shanghai to LA, $1 million, and then just to get your stuff onto a plane, there was a week long queue of trucks into the airport just to get into your material onto a plane. So there's some just crazy war stories that people shared with us. And so, for instance, at GM, they were able to figure out how to get the product to Korea, and then from Korea, there was air freight out of Korea. So in other cases, it involved working with established 3PLs. California set up a warehouse with UPS Healthcare Logistics, stood it up in, I think, a week or two. So in some cases, working with reputable third parties was really important to this response, and getting support from colleagues who were in supply chain and in the private sector was really important.
Thank you, Dr. Hanfield. Dr. Wu, what did you observe that worked with suppliers?
Yeah, I would like 2 points to what Dr. Hanfield said. One is in the report, we call it deputized state agent. So Rob mentioned the GM, the embassies, the UPS, or the large states. And in the medium size and smaller states, there are citizens of the states that come forward and become the agent, like state agent, a deputized agent, as we call it, working overseas. In one case, the whole newspaper, this is the date I'm standing in front of the factory to validate the product is there. And so there are a lot of stories like that where there's just eager citizens coming to for the help. Another aspect is that within the U.S., within the states, the supply chain manager, the contract officer, buyers become the solution providers. So in one case, the state could not get the masks, so they had to figure out how to contaminate the used masks. So they have to figure out what equipment we use. Maybe it's from a company that make dry fruit. And so they have to configure the process of decontamination. So the procurement officers and buyers are really entrepreneurs within the emergency operations and to design the solutions for the states. So that was quite interesting.
Thank you, Dr.
Very.
Wu.
Mm-hmm.
Shifting back to our leaders here, this panel on the stage with me now, let's talk about some of the factors that worked with the suppliers from your perspective, Roz and George. What would you identify as some of the key factors that contributed to a successful supplier engagement? Roz?
Okay.
Sorry.
I just want to make sure it was my turn.
Go right ahead.
Like every other state, as I mentioned before, we got a voluminous number of emails, and it was difficult to try to dig through. And we were also, my staff have a fairly decent sized staff, and they were all getting the same emails. So people are all answering differently and trying to push the information over to the DEM logistics staff for processing through needs. And so we worked to have a single point so that when we got all of those emails in, they would flow through one place. Everybody else could delete their copy. We were able to get that over, look at the different things they had to offer, then get that information to DEM so that they could order for the state. In Florida, the counties could order their own as well, but primarily the state was trying to get everything to them. And so it was very useful to us to be able to do that. And once you're able to do that and get a direct relationship, I think that is so important. And it really was important during this pandemic to get a real person that answers the phone, as opposed to one of the, I call them ghost emails. You never know who's getting them and where they're going. So getting a direct relationship, and then having that team across at DEM, the National Guard, along with their logistics team, working with our folks, I think really helped get the suppliers narrowed down to how they could work with the state more effectively instead of doing sort of a shotgun approach.
Very good. George, your experience, what did you identify as some of the key success factors?
I'd mention three of them. One might be obvious, but the ability to make immediate payment and advance payment, especially early on, especially when you're obviously dealing with limited supply commodities that you have to acquire. Second, and I know this was similar in many states, but having a deliberate vendor management team that vetted suppliers, vetted requirements, and this was good, I felt, for both industry as well as the district, because we had a group that was focused on it to understand product, understand service capabilities, and also a place where our industry partners could make sure that they're updating along the way. I think the third area was being able to work very collaboratively, as I mentioned before, having the contracting officer and the emergency management personnel and the technical experts in the emergency, in this case, the health department, being able to work closely as a team and being able to get information in a fluid environment on requirements, what was available from industry, and did that meet our ventilator, our N95, did it meet the specific requirements that we had? So that collaboration was really critical.
Thank you both, Roz and George. Those were very insightful to help us understand the things that were going on between CPOs and suppliers. We're going to shift back to our academic researchers now. Dr. Wu, let's start with you. What would you identify as some takeaways? What opportunities do you think exist, based upon the interviews, for collaboration and engagement going forward between CPOs and suppliers?
So now we have a pandemic. It's kind of hopefully in a rear mirror, and now we have there's more natural disasters, right? And there's also IT security, and there's just more emerging supplier risks that we see as even the supply chain is decoupling. So one issue here, I think, is that we find really state procurement need to become supply chain management, and the pandemic shows that some states really get into the supply base to understand what are the sources, what are the materials and technology involved in product, and rather than relying on a broker or brokerage in this sense. So I think there's a convergence between private sector and public sector in supply chain management to deal with the disasters and infrastructure needs, the IT security, what equipment we buy, where to buy, and all these issues. So I think the collaboration will be more down the road. There'll be more collaboration as state procurement become more get into the common, so to speak, of the supply chain. Yeah.
Very good. Dr. Hanfield, same question. What opportunities do you see for collaboration and engagement between CPOs and suppliers?
So I think there's really two kinds of collaboration. I think definitely CPOs and suppliers can work on business continuity plans, right? I think one of the lessons learned was, maybe in the past we've relied on distributors or, local suppliers, local distributors. And I think they're realizing now, especially for some of these critical materials, that we need to have business continuity plans. And we're working with the federal government on this issue at a national level around the strategic national stockpile, which I think we need to be rethinking that, and around the Biden EOs as well, around how do we address these supply chain vulnerabilities. So I think the idea of a pandemic playbook or a risk playbook or a disruption playbook is one that should definitely be developed in collaboration with suppliers. The other thing I would advocate is if you're developing a playbook, I think we also need to be thinking about how to drive collaboration within state government. And we found, in many states that in cases where procurement was decentralized, you had sort of multiple agencies within the state spinning their wheels or reinventing the wheel by attempting to buy from unknown suppliers or fraudulent brokers or what have you. One of the things with state procurement offices, we have strong negotiation skills. We have contract management expertise. They're generally, systematic and organized and know how to get things done. And I think what we're seeing is, there's the recognition. If there's a silver lining here, is that people recognize the role that procurement can play in a national disaster of this sort. And I think we started to see procurement literally collaborating much closer with their EMCs, their emergency management centers. And in some cases, they were actually living in working out of the warehouse, in some cases living as well within these EMCs and working closely to manage contracts, manage suppliers, and what have you. And I think that, one of the things we're starting to see is, in states where you don't have as strong a line between procurement and the leadership in the state, that needs to be firmed up. I know there's a few people from the great state of New Mexico on the phone here, and I'll call out New Mexico, and we spoke with your CPO, and he said, they would have, if they had asked me earlier, I could have done a lot more. And there were a lot of states, not just New Mexico, in that position, by the way. And I think that's an area where we're going to see states starting to beef up and raise the leadership of state procurement at that level.
Thank you. Both of you shared some great perspective there. I appreciate that. It's encouraging to hear you both say from these interviews that there is a role for procurement to play, a great opportunity as such. And tools like risk guide manuals, I think many of us are looking for those as added resources. So I'll shift back to our leaders here on the stage with me. Same question. Roz, let's start with you. What opportunities do you see for collaboration and engagement stemming from this exercise?
Well, to actually add on to what he just said, in the state of Florida, like other states, I'm sure we brought the prime vendors in. When I say prime, those that we know that have many of the products that we need, even if they weren't able to get them right then, they actually were in the EOC, and some of them still are. We had trailers outside that they would bring up, and they parked them outside the EOC. So they were working their same 12 to 16 hours like we were last year. And so when you're there, you don't have to, we had disruption with cell phone coverage during some of the really busy times. So if they're there with you, you can grab them, and it's a lot different to grab them than to try to get somebody on the phone on a Sunday night at 10 o'clock. So every night at 10 o'clock, George can tell you, we had something happen all the time. So that was, I think that collaboration, which we had begun in the EOC at a lighter level a couple of years ago, but now has become more broad. So I believe that us working with the supplier community to embed where possible certainly does strengthen that. And then a lot of these suppliers that come in there also have subs they work with, so they're able to connect with them a lot quicker than we could. So that was one thing. I would say some of the things that are already tenants that we have become more important. So the things like, building that relationship with the vendor and having direct communication, that was always important, right? So everybody knows that. But during this, it became even more important. So we needed to have a real cell phone number. We needed to be able to have that first name of that person we can get in touch with, and you should be able to get in touch with them anytime you need to. So I think from the supplier side and from the state side, that made a lot of sense. So we've strengthened that up where we don't just have that phone number, 800, whatever, we have somebody's name. And the only other two things I would add to that are compliance. It's always seen as a sort of a dirty word from the supplier side, and it's not. It's just something that all of us have to work together to make sure that we get what we need that meets our requirements, and that compliance is just with those. And then from the state side, we need to know we don't know everything. So quit trying to tell the suppliers everything that we need to have when it's their business. So I think from both sides, we've been able through this to start to understand that both sides need to sort of work in their strengths and then allow that their other partner to do their job as well.
Thank you, Roz. George, turning to you, your impressions where there may be opportunities for more collaboration between CPOs and suppliers.
I think it's, continuing to work with industry to solve our challenging needs in very innovative ways. In COVID, we really depended on our industry, really depended on our district small businesses and businesses, global businesses as well. But really working with them in an innovative way to produce hand sanitizer with distillers or with coffee roasters when there wasn't that available. Working with a major sports clothing manufacturer to be able to use those warehouses and factories locally to produce medical grade gowns in a very efficient way. Working with fashion designer too, because they had pre-established logistics chains involved to be able to acquire PPE. So it's continuing to work with industry to meet our critical needs in an innovative way. Of course, to do that, you have to have contracting and procurement methodologies and procedures in place to be able to bring that innovation in. But I think that's was a great way of collaboration in a way that will continue going forward.
Thank you, George. We now have an opportunity, based upon this last question, before we proceed, we're going to turn to you, our audience, and ask if you have any recommendations for supplier collaboration. We'd like to if you would, put those in the chat. We'd like to see if you have any thoughts, ideas to share, that we then could read a few of them off to our listening audience, those that are participating with us. So take a few moments and perhaps you can do that. Allowing a few moments for folks to collect their thoughts and maybe add comments. Recommendations for greater or increased supplier engagement, collaboration. So we have one, a challenge that was had that Allstate could consolidate orders. This is not only a cost-effective way to do business, but will allow you to secure items in a timely fashion instead of piece shipping. So that's a good idea. Another one, does it make sense to establish supplier councils to have a strong running dialogue between different members on these items? Emphasizing domestic supply for key areas. Proactive strategy sessions with vendors to get insight from what's happening in other markets. So these are some great ideas that are coming forward from many of the folks, and we appreciate that. To our panel, those of you, as you've seen some of these, any thoughts about the ideas that are being shared? I think there's some good recommendations.
I do too. We try to have forums with different groups, but I think we never had one with this group before, and I think it would be very beneficial to get them together.
Very good. Excellent. Well, we thank you for those ideas, recommendations. Certainly we will be capturing those and making those available as part of the notes from this session. Turning back to our panel again here, let's discuss for a moment the long-term impact, if you will, the pandemic may have on the way things might look going forward. What changes might we expect as we look forward here? So let's start with you, George.
The continuation of a strong and proactive emergency operations center. There was I mentioned in the chat box about Playbooks, and We have had playbooks for a variety of emergency potentials that we have in the district, and we do practice them. I think that this has certainly invigorated us to really double down on those playbooks, really be thinking strongly about supply chain service needs in those areas. Continuation of the Strategic Logistics Center and really capitalizing on the ability to centralize the management of procurement needs, the receiving and the distribution of those items in other areas in the district that worked well. And the other one that hear from a lot of CPOs, and I know Roz as well, but being able to continue to capitalize on the tools that we've now become much more fluent in, such as using Teams, to be able to collaborate in a virtual way, and doing that in a quality way, but being able to do that virtually. Those are things that I think will have a long-term effect that really were born out of COVID.
Excellent. Thank you, George. Your thoughts, Roz, please, on the same question.
Well, very similar to George, and actually I sort of felt like on March, say 30th, April 2nd or 3rd, when pretty much everything sort of got out of reach for all states. I think we had that, Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore kind of moment where we didn't know what to do. And interestingly enough, and I think this comes from the private industry is way ahead of the states, generally speaking, on this, but we had contemplated going completely paperless, had done it partially, but we contemplated it. We thought about teleworking and just never really did it. Well, all of a sudden, in 48 hours, pretty much we were paperless and we were all teleworking. I shouldn't say 40, but within a week or so, everybody was doing that. And so they wouldn't do it before out of fear, I think. And I believe that the sky didn't fall, nobody died from doing these two things. But the paperless issue is here to stay, I think. It certainly is with us. I can't imagine anybody wanting to go backward on that. Teleworking, I think, for both supplier community, I've talked to quite a few suppliers, and certainly on the state side, I believe is going to be pretty routine and permanent, whether it be a partial or full. I think that's here to stay. And I think, so right now we have like quarterly meetings with our vendors, and they usually fly in and we do these meetings. And as we went virtual, I'm like, why did we do that? It costs money to do that. And why would we do that? So I don't really see, except for, we would do it by exception, why we would want to do it in person anymore when we can do the same thing via Teams or GoToMeeting or all the different platforms. So for us in Florida, I think the fear kept us from doing things we needed to do. And I hated that the pandemic pushed it, but it certainly did. And I feel like those things will make us more efficient.
Thank you both. Appreciate that. At this point, we're going to move to open up to our audience questions that you may have. If you would send those forward at this time. Becca, if you'll let us know when you receive some of those, perhaps we can read them aloud.
Yeah.
And allow our panel an opportunity to respond to some of those questions. Coincidentally, before we take the first question, going back to earlier, your thoughts on recommendations for better collaboration. I noticed one of them put forward the idea about Unicom during the past was used as a secure chain of control between OEMs and things. So that was a very worthy idea, I think. Regional federal distribution centers. So again, we're receiving some good ideas, recommendations. Becca, do you have any questions?
Yeah, we've got quite a few here. So here's one. What have been the major challenges in utilizing CARES Act and federal funding to serve the needs of so many state and local entities?
Okay. George, would you like to take that one first?
I'd say we're just getting started, really.
Yeah.
I don't have much more to say on it other than that.
All right.
I would echo George's deep thought on that.
Nothing more to say on that. Did our academic researchers hear this question?
Yes, I
Based on
did.
your interviews, based on your
Yeah.
interviews and what you've learned from this survey, do you have any thoughts to share as well?
So I think the CARES Act came with a lot of stipulations and conditions, around what you could buy and the time frame. I think of when you could buy it, right? So there were a lot of requirements around that. I think the funding itself was good, but one of the areas I would have liked to have seen more support, at least from the federal level, is actually the distribution of materials, from the national stockpile. And there were some masks, for instance, and ventilators that came through, but it was far short of what was needed for many of these states. So I think the message to me was, the CARES Act was good. It was a shot in the arm to help support state budgets that were literally, up in the air. No one really knew how much, how they were going to cover all of these costs. But it could have been a lot more. And what was actually needed was a national policy around how to distribute critical items during a crisis like this. And I think I don't think it was done equitably, quite honestly. I think it was. I think it was very haphazard, in fact, and it's not clear to me how well it was done. And I think that's an area where there's a real need for some additional research to look at this issue of what does equitable distribution look like during a major disaster like this. Ooh, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Oh, well said.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I see a few comments coming in regarding the response in terms of 100% on the distribution from the national stockpile in the states competing against the federal government for the product. And you shared that previously, Dr. Hanfield and Dr. Wu, as not only an outcome from the study, but your own experiences as well. So we thank you. Other questions, Becca? And by the way, I'm glad that we have sufficient time here. We want to make sure we have good interaction with our audience with questions. So we're going to turn back for another one, Becca.
Yeah, Roz and George, can you speak to how you handled the deluge of supplier offers to help?
Okay.
Yes.
Who would like to go first? George.
I'll just say briefly. I did mention it before. We did establish a vendor management team that was the place wherever we received the high volume of offers to help, which were many great. Some were not legitimate, but just the high volume. One place to be able to focus on contacting, vetting, using FaceTime to see product, getting a good understanding of what's available was, I think, critical. It also gave a point of contact where any industry member could go and say, hey, am I on the list? Have I been vetted? Do you have me down for, this type of PPE? And we're able to go back to those lists and to that team to get a good understanding of what was out there.
Very good. Raj, you had a thought?
Yes, I agree with everything George said. And he had mentioned earlier, which I think most states have also done, where we had within the EOC, we had doctors and nurses, obviously. And so we started out with them sending us their spec sheet. And yes, that matched what we had. Well, then we would get product in that wasn't up to par. So what we would do is ask for samples, and we get a sample in and take that to the nurse or doctor, whichever area we're in, and have them vet that particular product against the specs. So some of the not so ethical vendors were sending us product that didn't match their spec sheet. So that was one thing. And as I mentioned earlier, the way we funneled it was through my shop of getting thousands and to multiple people into a single list that we would just continually send back and forth to the EOC. It was a very daunting thing. I will tell you, I've never dealt with that many vendors, that deluge that came in. It was hard to do.
Thank you both. Yeah, I see a comment here. Maureen is saying that they had vetting teams set up to work with another agency to validate businesses in order to minimize some of those problems. So Very good.
I would just add as well, the NASPO network and the ability for we had weekly discussions with the CPOs across the state, and being able to talk through what were the challenges, how are you dealing with this, and having engagement with the FBI to the do not buy from list, for example. That was extremely helpful as well, and a real example of how the network out there, people are dealing with it in another state if you're dealing with it in your state.
Right.
Thank you, George. I'm glad you pointed that out. NASPO did make a concerted effort to work with the FBI regarding who were good vendors to work with that were properly vetted. And suppliers themselves were opening up and allowing us to ask sensitive questions and to bring forward good recommendations to our members who to do business with. So we were very appreciative of that relationship and hope that it provided value to our members.
But I have to tell you, the first time the FBI called and left me a message was, a little bit daunting. They just said, "Hey, Agent so-and-so from the FBI called you. Please call him back." I'm like,
It can be daunting for sure. We were very appreciative of the relationship and the line of communication that we established with them. Okay, Becca, another question perhaps?
Yeah. How did you address the quality or lack of in your supply chain?
Yeah, I saw that. That's a good. Monica brought that forward. So let's have Rob and George, and then Wu and Rob. I'm going to come to you. Your observation as well. Anything that came out of the study regarding quality issues. So let's start with Roz and then George.
well, I think we sort of, and I think she's reading these as they came in,
Yep.
but it's very similar to what we just answered in that, we had a vetting process to see which ones, like I said, we started with the spec sheet. And when we realized that wasn't 100% effective, then we had a sample sent in so that we could have that tested with our medical staff to make certain that it was an N95 equivalent or an N95 or whatever that product was. We had particular issues with gloves, believe it or not. We were getting all kinds of with the stuff on them, the gloves that kept coming apart. I can't recall. We had to do water tests. It was crazy. We did water tests on the gowns. We actually pour water on the gown. And I mean, it got to where we didn't, and this was a difficult place to be. And I think George would agree, not to be 100% trustful. You had to trust but verify, so you get these samples in and we had to test them. So I think that was something we just got used to doing. And once the vendor community got used to us doing that, then it became sort of an automatic thing. Like anything else, you do it 500 or 600 times and it becomes habit.
Good. George?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Roz said. And I mentioned before the tight collaboration between the contracting officer, the technical expert, the doc that really knows how these ventilators work and how you can test them. And being able to, in a fluid environment, being able to make sure you've got the right requirement before you're pulling the trigger on it. On the other point here, though, is tying in the strategic logistics center and the distribution centers that we've established, having a quality control person that is an expert in PPE at our distribution site to be able to do the testing that Roz is mentioning, to work with industry to get samples, test those samples before we're getting them in. But certainly as product does come in, to be testing it to make sure that it meets the needs.
Excellent. That would be one great strategy, have a quality control person there. Dr. Hanfield, Dr. Wu, any observations that you can share based upon the study addressing the quality issues?
Yeah, I don't really have a lot to add. Okay. I think Roz and George have covered it really well. I will add, I think the only thing I'll add is, samples, absolutely, you had to get samples. You couldn't take it on word or if they said they followed the spec sheet, there was no way of knowing that. And I think there were some great examples of, dealing with, putting up inspection sites and just telling people, hey, if you want to send me a sample, I'll consider it. But otherwise, there's no way you're going to sell me anything, right? So that's a best practice, definitely, that we took away from that.
Okay, I noticed an observation here in the chat room. Jim Coangelo noted that in Michigan, the vast majority of supplier issues and quality dealt more overseas than domestic. So that probably is understandable given things coming in you may not always be able to control. Becca, another question for us, please.
When facing future supply chain disruptions, how can states better leverage the knowledge of the supplier community to navigate issues?
Okay. Did our academics hear the question, our researchers?
Yes.
Let's have you to begin first, your response, if you don't mind. Dr. Wu, then Dr. Hanfield.
Sure.
There are many. I've just started then. So one thing from a study is that the states, Ross, pick you out, and also Louisiana, that has ever experienced the disaster regularly, definitely have this muscle memory, what you call it. And they just, by nature, they by instinct, they know what to do even before there's an official announcement. So there's a definite experience from the states, from the southeast states, that they really set up some of the best practice for many other states. Yeah. So
Very good example that you referenced there. Dr. Hanfield.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misperceptions out there that CPOs and state procurement people cannot talk to buyers, right? There's part of that maybe stems from myths around the FAR perhaps that originated that. I think we do need to spend more time talking to our suppliers and planning with them around future business continuity issues. I think contractually, there's other things we can do as well to create incentives to make sure that suppliers can keep inventory for us and perhaps even rotate it on a regular basis for supplies that we know are critical. And the other piece I think is we're seeing the role of procurement goes simply beyond contracting to supply chain management. And as we do that, we're going to expand the relationships that we have with our suppliers to be able to manage warehouses, to be able to manage logistics, to be able to manage inventory. And I think these are interesting challenges, and we're going to have to spend time really developing innovative approaches to deal with our suppliers in these kinds of areas. It's a huge opportunity, I think, for us. And given that it's an emergency, like I said, the silver lining is the timing is right to engage in these kinds of discussions today.
Thank you both. Dr. Hanfield, I think you did an excellent job there highlighting that to the extent what procurement involves, that entire supply chain platform, to be prepared to understand it, how to facilitate it, how to better manage it to make it effective. So good observation. Thank you. George, you wanted to respond.
I mean, I think the docs hit it right on the head with the collaboration with industry. But I think it gets back to a basic tenet of good contracting and procurement too, is understanding your requirement, and in a way that you really understand it, you really know what you need. You're really in those playbooks thinking through worst case, best case. What are you going to need from a service perspective? What are you going to need from a commodity perspective? And when you're thinking about emergencies and you're doing your playbook and you're doing your emergency planning and you're doing your operations, incorporating industry in that planning, incorporating industry in the emergency exercises that you go through as well.
We have that term playbook once again. I know all of us taking notes, our playbooks are going to begin to become much thicker and much stronger, and a very resourceful tool for us. Roz?
Yeah, I wanted to add that so this is not new to us, depending on which state and which issues you have. So about 4 or 5 years ago, we had a really significant issue in our IT industry and procuring in the state of Florida for IT. And so I made the decision, which was not loved by many, to have a IT forum where we blasted out on our vendor bid system to every vendor who wanted to attend this forum on IT and tell us what was wrong with our system. Okay, not very well received on the front end as far as doing it, but we had over 450 vendors attend this, and they gave us a lot of information. Some of it, came in different deliveries, if you will, but we were able to take away from that. And it made my system strong. We changed the way we procured IT staff aug. We changed IV&V. We changed management consulting. We changed all of these things based on input from the vendor. So why wouldn't we do it in this situation too? So we could open up a forum and bring everybody in, and they can tell us what they feel would make it stronger. And we can we can do one of two things. We can work within our state system to try to make it stronger within our state, and then we can reach out to neighboring states and try to see if we can work together for a spider web of different strengths that we could do over, particularly from Louisiana, Texas to Florida and up to North Carolina. That whole area, we deal with the same thing every year on just separate of the pandemic. But it's that kind of thing that allows the vendor community to believe that they can have an open dialogue with the state. Because if you narrow it to one vendor at a time and they give you some information, but if you give them a block to sit in as a group, they will feed you. They will gunfire information at you. I don't mean that literally. They will give you good information.
Thank you, Roz. I noticed in the chat box, Dr. Hanfield, you published a link for folks that they could reference to in terms of preparing next or playbook, things of that nature for the next healthcare crisis. Any comment you want to share? And then George, I'm going to turn to you on the next question about should the playbooks be public. So Dr. Hanfield, comment?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So this is an article we published in the Harvard Business Review just this past year, the last couple of months, that talks about building a playbook and how do you prepare for the next major health crisis. And actually, there's a reference to a couple of states in there. So based on some of the discussions I had, so you can refer to those and know where those came from.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. So George, you've mentioned a couple of times regarding the playbooks. Nice question came out. Should the playbooks be public?
So not necessarily my policy area.
Okay.
But I would say that portions, right? And you have a playbook, and for example, we have a 4th of July every year. It's a big event down in the mall. There are federal, district, municipalities around the area that are all involved. There are security pieces of it. There are logistics pieces of it. And so obviously there are things that you would not want published, right. But there are certainly also sections that affect the public and that the public needs to understand what happens in an emergency. So I think it's a good graduate school answer if it depends.
It is.
And it's probably a mix.
I agree.
You framed that beautifully. Well done. Very delicate question and how to respond to it. But basically you're saying, hey, folks, work with your communications officer, I guess, in those regards.
And the law.
And the law. Thank you, Roz. Excellent. Okay, Becca, I think we're ready for another question.
Okay. To the academic researchers, what type of supply chain management practices could be best utilized in state government?
So, Dr. Wu, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Dr. Hanfield on that question.
Come top of my mind is supply chain mapping. So beyond the first tier, the brokers, right, the distributors, especially in PPE arena, where are the other sub-tier upstream suppliers, and what do they buy? And given what they buy, where are the pinch point, the bottlenecks? So there's a risk assessment related to supply networks. Definitely is one critical thing that comes to my mind. Rob?
Good observation.
Yeah, I would say, one of the areas I'm really passionate about is the idea of control towers. I think we have to have better visibility into our state assets, whether it's inventory, whether it's understanding who has what material that's needed, where it's positioned, and these control towers are not that expensive. You can get for surprisingly little money, information that can be collected into a data lake. And broadcast into a control tower, which is like a dashboard showing you where stuff is. And I think that at a state level, we're going to become much more concerned on what material we have, where it is, its consumption, and how do we manage it. And I think that would allow us to eliminate a lot of the excess and obsolete that we often run into, where stuff expires and we got to throw it away, and we can avoid those kinds of issues.
Hey, two great thoughts. Thank you both. Upstream grid locks, control towers, those are great concepts and things that we probably need to be aware of. Coincidentally, George, our audience thinks you did a great job in responding as well. They want you to run for, one says governor for DC, they're going to vote for you. So
I'm very happy as a CPO.
you're happy as a CPO. Okay. Becca, another question, please.
What opportunities are there to further utilize cooperative contracting in response to future emergencies?
All right, let's turn to our leadership here on the stage for that. Roz, would you like to share your thoughts?
Well, okay.
Opportunities for cooperative contracting
With this type of disaster.
Well, type of disaster.
Unfortunately, when this hit, we did attempt to do that. It's just so did everybody else on the planet. So that even though we had a contract with all of these vendors, it didn't matter. It should have. There's no way for it to matter because they had everybody on the planet wanting their product. So I think that I don't know how to construct a different supply chain from the manufacturer up to whomever we deal with based on the fact that the supply itself was rare in the context of having hundreds of millions of people needing it. So I'm not sure how we could better leverage that because the states use our contracts when they can all the time. I mean, most states do. And I guess everybody has their own vetting process, but certainly Florida does. And we would have used them this time. It's just the product wasn't there.
Okay.
I think when you get beyond planning in your own state and you start thinking about regional issues, regional weather issues, and you start really maturing your playbooks, you really start thinking about that and engaging with other jurisdictions, and you're thinking about what are the commodities and the services and the equipment that you're going to need in those various areas. Using a cooperative approach, even on like an indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity type perspective, where you're thinking broadly about what you need, you've got orders and timelines in place to be able to get those things, but you don't necessarily always have them, right? Or working with regional partners in areas where you need to have inventory in-house, but inventory stales. And so, for example, masks and gowns, working with the hospitals locally to be able to work those supplies and commodities through those areas that are going to be using them. But you're still thinking broadly about your requirements. And then you're able to, if the better you get your requirements, the better you're able to cooperate with other jurisdictions, and the better you're able to get more solid contracts in place for that.
So a couple of things to share with our audience. Some of you may have known and may not have known, but NASPO Value Point had an opportunity to share, I think, the value that we could bring in this pandemic. One, we were engaged with the National Governors Association on a call to share with them that there was a multi-state consortium available to them for cooperative contracting, cooperative purchasing, if you will. That was informative. I think that led to a few additional questions. Second, there was a situation where some of the states came together for the very purpose of creating a multi-state consortium on some needed PPE. Again, we stepped forward to inform them that we had relationships already in place that perhaps they could use our contracts. Fortunately, given the timeline they were under, and they were wanting to turn this around very quickly. They were talking in terms of 10 days. So many of you, how would you like to put from cradle to grave a process on PPE in 10 days? Value Point came forward and was able to demonstrate we have contracts in place for such items and we went to the suppliers, working with those. So we provided a solution on a very timely basis. I hope that speaks a little bit as well to this question. Becca, another question, please.
The pandemic certainly emphasized the need for strengthening supplier relations. What tips would you give to procurement offices looking to do that? What do you want suppliers to know when they approach to engage?
Very good. Roz.
Pick me. I really think, and I know there's some states out there that some of them may be on the line right now that are not able to engage with suppliers in an open manner. And I wish there was a way that we could help you with this, because the suppliers need to be able to come in, even in Florida, even if we have a procurement going on, which is an area in which they wish to engage, they can still come in and talk to us about an active contract they're in, because we still have to do business. So you've got to be able to engage with your suppliers. And honestly, if you are unable to engage with your suppliers, you're going to get the same thing you've always gotten. You will get no innovation. You will get no updated industry standards. You won't get that unless it's just placed into their proposal outside of your specs. So to me, it's vitally important to bring your supplier community in. And sometimes they'll do it on their own. Sometimes we invite them in as a group. We just get a representative number in and just say, hey, what's out there now? I just believe if you don't do that, you will never be able to graduate change and make things better and more efficient.
Yeah, I just add, I think it needs to be deliberate, it needs to be often, and it needs to be multifaceted. And having in the district, we have a monthly course, but it's an engagement session where anybody can join and listen to how we do contracting in the district. Having an ombudsman that can always be reached to. I think transparency is critical here, right?
Yes.
In state transparency requirements, posting contracts that are awarded, posting payments that have been made, and so that if you're interested in doing business with that state, then you've got the ability to understand what they're buying and become part of the process. So it's got to be deliberate, it's got to be often, and it's got to be multifaceted. And in many cases, it has to be specific to industries. We will have events that are for construction and for our information technology community. We have a wonderful chief technology officer in the district that is very engaged with our chief contracting officer on information technology, and they have events monthly.
Very good.
So it's engagement, and it has to be done often.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, I believe. Becca?
I would just add one other thing to that, perhaps
Okay.
to that comment. I think one of the things that we need to do well is talk to our suppliers, like we said, before we issue the RFP, right? And really define what that statement of work, what that SLA is. And we can do that by engaging with our stakeholders, truly understanding what the requirement is, but also build into that requirement things like business continuity, things like inventory support, and then allow suppliers to come up with ideas of things that they can do. And having those conversations early, can help you build a better RFP that can allow you to get, as we said, more innovative solutions that is going to help us to be better prepared.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Dr. Hanfield. Innovative ways to create solutions and working with our suppliers. Excellent. Becca, one last question.
Okay. As a supplier, we received cost increases up to 400% on gloves due to the breakdown of the supply chain. In the very beginning, we had agencies giving strong pushback on these cost increases. How have you handled existing contracts that had PPE, such as masks, gloves, disposable clothing on it?
Okay. Roz and George, do you understand the question being asked here?
No.
It's how do you manage cost increases, particularly on PPE during crises? Would that be a safe summation? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that depends on where you're at in the emergency, and it depends on supply and demand, right? And
Yes.
yes, ideally you want to be in a place where you understand your usage, you understand completely the marketplace, have vehicles in place that you're getting the product in the time that you needed it in a very commonsensical, timely way. That doesn't always work. And so as the markets matured, we found ourselves doing less emergency procurement and more getting many more bids and really getting a good sense of product and managing it that way. From a supplier perspective, I mean, I and you guys know this better than I do, but you got to know your market and know what you're signing up to as well. And you don't want to be in a position in a very fluid marketplace where you're committing to a price that you don't have the inventory to deliver.
And I would just add to that, I know under an EO, the executive orders, it's very quick and easy to do up front, like we had to in March, April, May of last year. But as we moved into the fall, when prices started coming down because the supply started to gear up, then we started getting bids based on the fact, no, we're not paying that anymore. We don't have to. Mm-hmm. So I think that he's right. I think that the vendor community also has to know what their supply chain is and what the expectation of the states are.
Thank you both very much. We wanted to make sure that we had sufficient time today for this interaction, the question and answer period. I think that we've utilized that very well. We're at a time that almost at the close here. Please join me in thanking our academic research partners, Dr. Wu, Dr. Hanfield, and the links that they provided. They did an outstanding job on this research project. I'm very appreciative to you, your leadership, your expertise that you provided. I know that our members will enjoy reading this. We pushed this product out to many other sources. We are receiving many positive comments regarding it. We have a follow-on with you. I look forward to sharing more with you regarding that. As well to George Shutter, our immediate past president, and Roz Ingram today, the current president. We appreciate you very much, the time you've taken to be on this panel with us. Becca, I'm going to turn it back to you for housekeeping remarks before we close the session.